Welcome to Building Connections, presented by IPCC. Each week, we delve into the world of construction, exploring how key leaders in the space shape the infrastructures of tomorrow. Discover the stories behind the solutions that impact municipal, commercial, and residential projects across North America.
Welcome to Building Connections, the podcast where we explore the intersection of infrastructure, innovation, and sustainability. I'm Greg Blackett, and today we're diving into a critical conversation about sustainability and our environment, and one that's going to be rooted in science, facts, and real-world applications. So to help us navigate this complex landscape, I'm joined by Dr. Matthew Wielicki, who's a geoscientist and an expert in climate and environmental science. Dr. Wielicki brings a scientific perspective on environmental trends, human impact, and the role of industry in sustainability. Dr. Wielicki, thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Greg. Thanks for having me.
So maybe just start off, just share a little bit about who you are, your academic background, and your expertise, and then we can hop into some of the other questions.
Sure. So I have a BS in biochemistry and cellular biology, actually. And I kind of shifted gears in graduate school and got a PhD in geochemistry. I'm an isotope geochemist, meaning that I look at these really little signals in rocks, ice cores, sediments, fossils, and try to tell a story about what the past environment looked like whenever that formation or rock or fossil was being formed. And so my previous work tended to be about early Earth and thinking about the origin of life and the conditions on very early Earth. But I kind of started to see this kind of climate narrative building in the earth science community. I mean, I was aware of it as a graduate student, but soon after I got a faculty position, I had two young kids, and I kind of started to think about this a little bit differently. I started to ask a lot of my students about the mental health aspects of just constantly being told that the planet is on fire, and this narrative that was building, this very dramatic, very kind of doomsday narrative. And I realized that it was having this dramatic effect. So I started to kind of dig into climate a lot more. I was tangentially attached to climate science because I was the one that was doing the isotope research for them, but I wasn't the atmospheric physicist. I wasn't putting all that together. I didn't really want to tell you the truth. It was very politicized. I saw that very early on. My advisor knew that. We both kind of wanted to stay away from climate science if we could in our personal research. But as I started to look at the data, I realized that the narrative didn't really fit the observable data in the way that I thought it should, at least to be this convinced in the way that we are scaring our youth. And so I started to speak up against it a little bit, just ask some questions. And I realized very quickly that that is completely taboo in academia. Maybe it's a little bit more accepted today. This is around 2020, COVID, and it was just unacceptable to raise any of these questions. Even though I'm showing peer-reviewed literature, I'm trying to show people a little more nuanced take, that it's not so simplistic. This is a very complex system. And it was essentially just, you're labeled a heretic. And so I quickly saw that tenure wasn't going to be a possibility. Even though I was successfully publishing papers and having students and everything, you just couldn't have these views and be accepted in the scientific community. So I left the University of Alabama and I started to write for myself. I have no chains. I have no government funding. I'm funded by the public, the people that are interested in my expert opinion. So I write on Substack. I have a Substack called Irrational Fear, and I'm in the process of publishing a book that's also called Irrational Fear.
Excellent. And so, Dr. Wielicki, one of the reasons why you're on the show here with us is to help us navigate all the information that we as a company and as individuals receive about the environment, and try to make heads or tails out of it. And so the first thing I wanted to jump into is, so when we talk about climate and environment change, like what's certain? What do we know is real? And what do we don't know? What's maybe still being debated or studied?
The only certainty is change. That's the one thing we know when we go back throughout all of the history, throughout the rock record, that there's just no stasis. Stasis is death, more than likely. If you look at the moon is essentially static. It's not a lot of change, but there's no life. And so if there's one thing that we know for sure in the climate system, it's that it's going to change. Okay. The problem is we now have a few decades, maybe 70 years, 50 years of really good real-time satellite data. And we've also been sending numerous climate scientists to go look at all of these glaciers and how they change. So we're really getting this day-to-day understanding of how the climate system is changing. In order for us to be able to make any comparisons, though, we need to have that same type of record in the rock record, the geologic record. And that just doesn't exist. We can kind of say it was a little warmer, it was a little cooler, but it's very difficult for us to say that a 0.5 degree change over a century is unprecedented. And that tends to be the narrative. We're making these claims that we're confident we knew how the climate was changing before humans were using fossil fuels. And that's just not true. We don't have that certainty. So that's the untrue part. The for sure part is the change. We should always be expecting change, and stasis should never be the goal.
Okay. So we're in a flux. Earth is always changing. And if you look back through the history of time, we've seen the fluctuations in Earth's temperature, different levels, reading levels of carbon, for example. And so, but the narrative now that you've talked about is really around the human impact of that change. And so, so maybe just to dig deep on that, is there any evidence, or how do we think about our impact on the change? And
So
is it, go ahead.
yeah, okay. It's a great question, and this is the $1 trillion question, right? This is what everybody wants to know. I'm never going to tell you that we don't have any impact. We definitely have an impact. You know that because you've probably been in a city and then driven outside of that city and felt it cool down a few degrees, right? We call that the urban heat island effect. That's due to the heat capacity of things like asphalt and glass and metal and buildings is very different than the heat capacity of soil and grass and trees. And it retains a lot of heat. It heats up more and it retains that heat. And so by all means, if you can imagine Phoenix where it is today with no city there, the temperature would probably likely be a few degrees cooler. And you could just drive outside of Phoenix and you'll experience that little bit of cooling. But that's difficult to regulate, right? So that tends to be ignored in terms of the factors that the IPCC, for example, likes to look at, because how do you regulate development, right? We're not going to talk about dismantling cities. That's crazy. So then the next thing is the greenhouse effect, right? So the atmosphere does have a warming effect. If you took away the atmosphere, the planet would be dramatically cooler. It would be something like minus 18 degrees Celsius. So the atmosphere does have a warming effect. That warming effect is primarily driven through water vapor. Water vapor is the primary greenhouse gas. It is in the, orders of magnitude more abundant than the trace gases like CO2 or methane or nitrous oxide that we talk about as greenhouse gases. And so the question becomes is how much of an effect is CO2 having, or the CO2 that we're releasing into the atmosphere having on the climate? That's a really difficult thing to tackle, because if we look at the geologic record, there's ice ages with really high CO2s and there's warm periods with really low CO2s. So surely I don't deny that CO2 has an ability to absorb infrared radiation. It does. We can test that in a lab. But it clearly seems to be a third or fourth order effect, because it wouldn't be cold at really high CO2s if it's the primary driver of temperature, the surface temperature. And so we really have to think of this much more holistically. It's much easier for the IPCC to point the finger at a single trace gas because they can focus their efforts on regulating that trace gas. But if you look at the true science, it's probably on the order of third or fourth round effects. I think the urban heat island is much bigger than that. That's probably second order. And when we get into first order effects, we're talking about the sun, solar activity, solar insolation, and things like ocean circulation patterns, because the vast majority of the heat that the Earth absorbs gets into the oceans, right? 71% of the surface. And they keep that heat. And so they're really the engines that are distributing the heat. So small changes in the circulation patterns can have dramatic changes in the surface temperature. I would argue significantly more than a 100 ppm increase, 150 ppm increase in the CO2 concentration.
And so one of the challenges that I think all of us face, companies and as individuals, is, there's a lot of information. If you open any paper, if you read anything online, from particularly mainstream media, you're going to see a lot of statements of fact. And as a company or as companies that are trying to set sustainability targets and really orient their company and structure their companies and their products to do the right thing so that it's actually going to produce some benefit for the earth, it's hard to know where to look for information. So the question I have for you, is how do companies that are under pressure for sustainability targets, how do we understand if those goals are science-based, or how do we ensure they're grounded in something that's science-based and that's going to maybe do something more positive versus just maybe following something that you read in the paper?
Yeah, so this is another really difficult question because this is essentially a values judgment, right? This is subjective. And the way that it's been sold to us so far is that any industry that produces a carbon-based product or outgasses any CO2 is just a net negative, no matter what it does. The fact is that we have reliable, cheap energy. We have materials that last centuries, right? Inert, they don't react with anything. And the benefit that those have provided us is so significant, it doesn't even compare to the possibilities of, okay, let's say the CO2 is the primary factor. Let's say it's doing all the warming. Thus far, the degree 1.2, people are arguing now that 1.5 last year, that warming, if you look at the human condition, has only led to beneficial things. We have higher crop yields. We have less people dying from famine. We have less people dying from extreme temperatures. All this extreme weather hasn't taken off. We have all this data. And so it just comes down to a values judgment. And you can't accept a intergovernmental panel whose entire idea is set up to demonize CO2. If you take that as the only word, then obviously everything comes back to decarbonizing. That's essentially, in my idea, suicide. I don't understand how you decarbonize a economy that currently has no alternatives to those products and to that energy. If you came out and you showed me all these new innovations and they were cheap and they were reliable and they worked as good, I would be all for it. Let's do it. But you can't put the cart in front of the horse. You can't say we're decarbonizing, and yet we have no alternative to all of the things. If you just look on the cameras that we're talking to right now and all of the plastics and things that we see right now, how could we even make this happen? So it's the cart is way in front of the horse on this stuff. And you guys as board directors and CEOs need to start ignoring a little more of the IPCC and starting to advocate for yourselves, because the amount of benefit that we have received from these industries that are so demonized, they just kind of put their tail between their legs and they go hide. You guys should be standing there going, look, you have every person right now has the opportunity to go completely carbon free. You have free will. You can do it right now. It's going to be really difficult. I doubt you're going to do that, but you have that option. Right? You guys should be touting that from the rooftops, because the idea that we haven't benefited from things like fossil fuels and plastics is just absurd.
Yeah, and one of the challenges that we're facing is, one of the products, or actually a lot of the products we make are made from PVC, and we produce pipes and pipe fittings, and one of the benefits of the product, the material, is that it can last over 100 years, if not more. And so the durability factor is so immense that, it's hard to explain to people when you're up against maybe a single-use plastic or something. And so oftentimes we just, we'll reflect the benefits versus, maybe an alternative material like, I don't know, concrete or iron or something like that.
Well, we used to use lead.
Yeah, we used to use right. Exactly. What are we going to go back to? Lead or wood? There's wood pipes, clay, and so you're right. There's no, what is the alternative? And so one of the tools that we use to look at more of a fact-based approach is a life cycle analysis, which I think is very useful. And that will actually show you, what your impact is on the environment or, ecology, freshwater systems, et cetera. And those actually, when you look at the data on the actual LCAs, it's actually quite compelling and reassuring. The challenge we have is to communicate that to, through the noise in the media.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
yeah,
That's, people ignore all that other stuff.
that's right. And so, you know, it's so hard to cut through the noise. What do you see as maybe some top misconceptions about sustainability in businesses? Like, are you seeing things that companies are doing that you just sort of saying, hey, you're kind of doing it wrong, or you're on the wrong path, and maybe you should be doing something different?
I think that a lot of the decarbonizing is virtue signaling. And I understand you want to look good to your buyers and things like that. So I get it. Um, One of the biggest hoaxes I see around is these carbon offsets, companies that are actually spending and investing large amounts of money into carbon offsets that could be going into modernizing their infrastructure, figuring out how to get rid of waste in the way that they operate. So many other things that would have a direct benefit to where the factory is or where the workers are actually working. When you're buying carbon offsets in Nigeria because some guy told you he's going to plant a bunch of trees, which half the time these things turned out to be total scams, that's doing nothing. That's just pure virtue signaling. So I really think that companies can look internally and find where there's waste and where there is real pollution, where workers are being put in harm's way, and try to see if they can minimize those things. And that would have a dramatically better benefit for their health, the workers' health, plus the local environments in those areas. So that's the biggest problem I see.
That's a huge problem because I think that's where a lot of companies are focused. And I was going to ask you in terms of a follow-up, where are other scientists on this? Are they with sort of where you're sitting? Are some of them still need the facts, or are you just sort of one lone voice in a sea of, many? Where's everyone sitting on this outside of
So
you?
the people who don't get paid by either the fossil fuel industry or the green, what I call the climate industrial complex, they're probably pretty right where I am. There's a lot of scientists who think that this is part of the solution, that things like carbon capture and offsets, which are going to have companies fund essentially, is going to be part of the solution, but they're taking a few percentage off each of these deals. So, it's really the money's making this stuff go around. In terms of the amount of carbon in the natural system and the amount that we're talking about removing with carbon offsets and things like that, it's analogous to trying to empty the ocean with a teaspoon.
So it sounds like there's still a lot of work to do in terms of understanding the reality, but I'm going to come back to it. There isn't there science or studies or a slew of papers out there that have been um, that underpin this thought, this underpin that carbon is, the source of warming, and like there's enough body of evidence out there that suggests that, or are you saying that it's not accurate?
So the IPCC says that they think that human activities are the primary source of the warming right now. And then they split those human activities into things like land use change and greenhouse gases. And they put the primary source on greenhouse gases. I don't think that the evidence supports that. I think they do that primarily because they're picking the thing they can regulate the easiest. Um, I don't deny that we are putting CO2 into the atmosphere through burning fossil fuels. And we have a really good way of testing that. We can actually look at the isotopic ratio of the atmosphere, the carbon isotopes, and they're changing. They're changing slightly. And so that's a signal that that is our burning, because the carbon that we pull out of the earth has a different isotopic signature. It's very old. And so we can monitor this, but if you compare the amount of CO2 that we're releasing into the atmosphere to how much is stored into the oceans, there's something like 2 to 3 orders of magnitude more CO2 trapped in the ocean than what we're actually releasing. So just a minor change in that giant reservoir would just completely swamp anything that we're putting out into the atmosphere. And so again, we have to just kind of put things in like first order, second order, third order, fourth order effects. And if we do this again as a values judgment, and we take the value that we're getting from cheap, reliable energy and from plastic use and weigh that against, maybe if they're saying something like 80% of the warming, so that would be like 1.1 or 1.3 degrees of that warming is attributable to the greenhouse gases. Well, what's the values judgment there? Is it that billions of people are migrating across the planet like Al Gore predicted when we would see this degree of warming? Or does it seem like crop yields are going up, things are working out, and the human condition continues to thrive even though there's these constant doomsday predictions? And so the IPCC may turn out to be correct, and it may be that greenhouse gases were driving the current warming that we saw. The problem is the warming wasn't the problem, right? The IPCC had to connect all these other dramatic things to the warming, because the truth is, if you go outside and it's 1 degree Celsius warmer, you're going to have no idea. In fact, if you went outside at sunrise and went outside 20 minutes later, it's likely 1 degree warmer. It warms about 1 degree per 20 minutes as the sun comes up. And so they attached all these other things to that, right? Extreme weather was going to go through the roof. Coastal cities were going to be underwater because of sea level rise. Crop yields were just going to die off because all of this land would just go barren because deserts would expand. Deserts are shrinking. Actually, the planet's greening. We're seeing that deserts are actually shrinking because CO2 is plant food. And so let's accept their warming as being all attributable to the greenhouse gases. If you do the values judgment again, you still end up having a ton of benefit from cheap, reliable energy and inert materials that don't react when you put them in your body, or don't react when you bury them in the ground and put sewage through them. I mean, it all comes back to that values judgment. So even if they're correct, let's give them the benefit of the doubt. The benefits dramatically outweigh the negatives.
Right. And IPCC, just for everyone, is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So that's a United Nations body. And so that body, so it's interesting. So they've set goals and targets and made predictions over time. And let's just talk about one you mentioned, climate-related disasters, hurricanes, fires, storms, maybe things like of that nature. So if they predicted that, I don't know when they did, are their predictions coming true, or are we seeing their predictions being validated or not?
No. So they will cherry pick events like the Palisades fire and say, look, this was a terrible fire. I agree. I went to school at UCLA. I used to take my wife to some of our first dates on a lot of those restaurants that burned down along Malibu. Beautiful area. It's tragic. It's terrible. None of that what happened that time was unprecedented. If we look at before, the winds weren't unprecedented. The dry spell wasn't unprecedented. In fact, the 2 years previous were the 2 wettest years for over a century. So the fact is we have really good data on natural disasters, and especially after the year 2000. There's a place in Brussels called the Center for the Research and the Epidemiology of Disasters. They manage what's called the EMDAT, the Emergency Database. And anybody can go to it. It's public record. So I just grabbed it just a week ago for an article on my Substack, and I did the analysis. So the 2024 numbers still might get updated because you could have had something that started, right at the end of December. Maybe it doesn't get reported. So maybe there might be a slight change. But I graphed it from 2000 to 2024, and there's absolutely no change if you look at things like extreme weather, wildfire, drought, storm. And so these negatives are not occurring. The data does not support any of those kind of extreme or these dramatic kind of conclusions. What it seems to be is that some years you have quite a few things because maybe there's a drought in a lot of areas, and some years you don't have many events at all, right? There's this kind of natural variability, but there's absolutely no trend over the last 25 years. And these are the last 25 years where more CO2 was put into the atmosphere than at any 25 years before. So in the time where the thing that's supposed to be driving all of these extreme weather events is being put into the atmosphere more than ever before, we're not seeing any change in those actual events.
Interesting. Okay, and that's something I've just learned, and I didn't know that. So the question I had was around validating the IPCC's forecasting or claims that support the position. Is there anything else that you see that hasn't been validated that the IPCC sea levels? Let's talk about that, or maybe ice cap melting. I mean, people often point to that. Where I live, it's northern climate. We haven't really seen the colder winters in the last few years that I remember. But that's a relatively short period in terms of the Earth's timeline. So, let's talk about some of those other things.
Yeah, so this is where it gets really tricky too, because climate models in my mind aren't science because they're untestable, right? So when they're telling me something's going to happen in 2050, I just have to just say, oh, okay, I guess, because in the scientific method, the whole point, right, is I get to test their hypothesis and then I can either reject or accept it. And then we can kind of go in this loop and we can eventually work towards the truth. But these models fall outside the scientific method. So the only way I can really do this is I can go to past IPCC reports and I can look at what they're predicting for the future and see whether that actually happened or not. And if you look at past IPCC reports, if you go back to like the 1990 report, the original, it's written very scientifically. There's no real doom. There's no extremism. There's no real alarmism. It's just like we should be monitoring the variability. It's likely that greenhouse gases and land use changes are having regional effects. This is going to be important because it's going to change how we grow crops and things like that. So this is stuff we should be paying attention to. And then you see it morph over time into something that really starts to make these kind of dramatic and doomsday predictions where it's, after like 2006, when Inconvenient Truth comes out, right? You start to see things really dramatically change, right? No longer is it we should be monitoring things. It's the Arctic will be ice-free in 2020, right? We'll have shipping channels across the Arctic, which would be great. It would actually lower the amount of shipping miles that we would need to use to move product. Across the Arctic. That doesn't happen. We're going to see no more glaciers in Glacier National Park, right? They're redoing all their signs because their signs literally say that these glaciers will not be here by year 2020 because they wrote them in something like 2006. And now they're going back and having to replace all these. So the things that are true is the planet seems to be warming gently. Sea level seems to be rising slowly, but it's not accelerating. It's nothing compared to 8,000 years ago when we were naturally coming out of the last glacial cycle where sea levels were changing something like 30x of what they're changing today. It's something we should be monitoring. It's something we need to be aware of. 20% of Netherlands is like a meter below a sea level. So it's not like we don't have engineering solutions to deal with these things. But the things that aren't coming true that I can, the only way I can judge whether their predictions are valid or even worth really listening to is all the doomsday stuff. None of the doomsday stuff is occurring. We're not seeing these crazy hurricanes. We're not seeing these giant flooding events. So, Asheville, North Carolina, people saw that and were like, oh my gosh, look, this is climate change, right? If you looked, there was a similar flood in 1917 and maybe even a bigger one in 1796. So obviously 1796, we don't have records for that, but we can actually look because as the flood goes over the banks, it deposits a bunch of material. We can go and look at these flood deposits. And so these things are not unnatural. We just kind of have weather amnesia, right? If it hasn't happened for 100 years on Earth, it means it's a very regular event on a 4.5 billion year old planet. It's just not regular in human lifetime.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Interesting. And on the side note, we've got a plant in Asheville, North Carolina. It was devastated by the most recent storm there, and we're still getting that plant up to speed. Well, this has been a good conversation. How else, or is there anything else you want to discuss in terms of how companies should think through climate change?
I mean, I think companies should be focused on pollution more than climate change, right? So I think that what you're going to see in this current administration is that CO2 is no longer going to be classified as a pollutant under the EPA. They used the Chevron doctrine to do that. And now that the Chevron doctrine was struck down, I think you're going to see CO2 no longer considered a pollutant.
What's the Chevron doctrine?
The Chevron doctrine was a Supreme Court decision that allowed agencies to dictate law that was a little bit nuanced because they're the experts, so they could actually interpret law without going back to Congress. So the EPA determined that CO2, even though you're exhaling 40,000 ppm as we speak, is a pollutant in the atmosphere because it's driving climate change, and it accepted all the IPCC findings. If once that's no longer classified a pollutant, I think companies should change their verbiage and say that they're focusing on pollution. And I think they should do their best to lower pollution. That is chemicals, that is things that have negative effects into the environment. CO2 is not one of those. And so you focus on the things that have negative impacts. Decarbonizing, or you want to put some solar panels on your roof because it lowers your electricity bill, for sure. I get it, but you're making that decision economically, right? You're making that because of the bottom line. So I fully support that. But let's focus on pollution and get rid of this idea. And you'll be in the clear because you know legal challenges once the EPA changes that kind of wording.
And so the wording that they're going to change is that they're going to say carbon is no longer a what?
A pollutant. So CO2 will no longer be considered a pollutant. Yep. Which is the way it was for centuries until they decided to reinterpret one of these laws and classified CO2 as a pollutant. So it's a relatively new thing.
And so if that happens, or you're saying it's going to happen, then companies should turn their attention to real problems around pollution. So things that are going into maybe waterways or being released in the air. And that's where the focus should be. And in pollution, is there any specific areas like that companies should focus on that you're seeing? So,
I mean, the truth is the Western world has done a really good job at cleaning up its environment. This is one of the arguments that if you want people to take care of the environment, just raise their wealth. Because if you can raise their wealth, they want to live in a place that's got clean air and clean water. It's when I traveled to Tibet, these holy lands in Tibet. I did a lot of work there in the Himalaya, and there was just trash everywhere because they didn't have the infrastructure to clean it up, even though it's like the holiest land for them and it's sacred. The infrastructure wasn't there. So we just need to focus on the real sources of pollution. But the truth is, in the US, we do a really good job. I'm sure we could do better. But yeah, focus on what comes out of the wastewater, right? What chemicals are going into the process? Are there alternatives that maybe break down easier? Can we get rid of some of these forever chemicals that don't seem to break down at all and tend to build up? Maybe there's alternatives we can find, but that would have so much of a benefit to human health, to the environmental health, than focusing on CO2.
Yeah. Well, this has been great, and I really appreciate your time. It's been very helpful, and I think if anyone's listening, it's very instructive in terms of priority setting, and whether it's around sustainability goals or just overall pollution reduction targets. Dr. Wielicki, thank you very much. Is there anything else you want to talk about?
No, thanks, Greg. Just thanks for having me.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Building Connections. You can find links to all of the resources mentioned in today's episode in the show notes. If you're finding value in our podcast, please take a moment to subscribe and leave us a 5-star review. It really helps us connect with more listeners like you. Don't miss out on future episodes. Keep listening and building connections with us.